My name is Olivia Hartman. I am 72 years old. For most of my life, I was an English teacher in a small New Jersey town. I used to tell my students that stories often begin where everything seems to end. I did not realize how true that was until the day I buried my only son. Rain was falling that morning. Not the gentle kind that nourishes the earth, but a cold and steady drizzle that soaked through black umbrellas and left every mourner shifting uncomfortably. Greenwood Cemetery was a field of dark coats, wilted lilies, and whispers carried away by the wind. I stood apart, always apart. That was how it felt for decades, though I rarely admitted it. My husband died young, leaving me to raise Richard on my own. I had been both anchor and sail for him, sacrificing without ever thinking of the word sacrifice. To love your child is to give. And so I gave, until there was nothing left of the young Olivia except a woman built of duty and quiet endurance. Richard was 38, too young to die, too young to leave me in this silence. The polished mahogany casket reflected gray skies as it was lowered into the ground. My breath caught with each inch it descended, as if part of my chest was being buried with him. Across from me stood Vivian, my daughter-in-law, 3 years his wife, and already the center of everything. Her black Chanel dress clung like armor, her makeup untouched by grief. She looked less like a widow than the hostess of a society gala. She had always known how to command a room, even when the room was a graveyard. I wanted to step forward, to take my rightful place at my son's side for the last time. But I remained frozen, separated by an invisible barrier. No one crossed it. No one ever did. When the service ended, people began drifting toward their cars. That was when a man in a dark suit approached me. "Mrs. Hartman," he said softly. His name was Samuel Pierce, my son's attorney. "The reading of the will is scheduled in 1 hour at the Manhattan penthouse. Your presence is requested." My presence? A formality. I nodded. The penthouse was a place I had rarely entered, though Richard had once filled it with books and warmth. Under Vivian's touch, it had become a showroom. Every line sharp, every surface gleaming, every corner curated for her image. When I stepped into the vast living room, I might as well have been entering a theater. The mourners had become an audience, wineglasses in hand, laughter already rising like smoke. I searched for Richard's spirit there and found nothing. Vivian glided to me, air-kissing my cheek without touching it. "Eleanor," she said, calling me by the wrong name, as she often did. "So glad you could make it. White wine?" "No, thank you." She shrugged, already turning to embrace a tall man in an Italian suit. Julian, Richard's business partner. His hand lingered too long on her back. I noticed. Others noticed. No one said a word. Mr. Pierce cleared, his throat by the marble fireplace. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we are here to read the last will and testament of Richard Hartman." The room hushed, though eyes sparkled with anticipation. Vivian positioned herself on the largest sofa, patting the cushion for Julian to sit beside her. The words came like hammer blows. "To my wife, Vivian Hartman, I leave the Manhattan penthouse, including all furnishings and art, my controlling shares in Hartman Technologies, the yacht, Silver Horizon, our vacation properties." It was everything. Billions in value, a life's work handed over as if marriage of 3 years outweighed a lifetime of motherhood. Murmurs rippled, then applause. Vivian's smile widened, flawless, victorious. And to my mother, Olivia Hartman. I straightened, waiting. A house in Cape Cod, perhaps. The books we hunted together, something, anything. "I leave the enclosed item to be delivered immediately following the reading." Mr. Pierce withdrew a crumpled envelope from his case. Old, creased, worn as if carried in a pocket for weeks. "That's it?" Vivian's voice rang through the silence. "The old lady gets an envelope?" Laughter broke like glass, sharp and cruel. Her friends joined in, even Julian chuckled, his hand resting boldly on her knee. My hands trembled as I opened it, because what else could I do? Inside was not jewelry, not a deed, not a letter. It was a single plane ticket. Destination, a rural village in France I had never heard of. Departure, tomorrow morning. The laughter grew louder. Vivian clapped lightly as if applauding a magician's final trick. "How thoughtful," she sneered. "Richard wanted to send you far, far away." I said nothing. Decades of silence had trained me well. I folded the ticket back into the envelope, tucked it into my coat, and whispered, "Thank you." It was all I could manage. The celebration resumed around me. People toasted to Richard's life as if he had thrown them a party from the grave. I slipped out, unnoticed. At home, I placed the envelope on my kitchen table beside a chipped teacup. I stared at it until the night wore thin. "Fight," a voice in me urged. "Contest the will. Take what is yours." But another voice, softer yet stronger, whispered, "Trust him one last time." Morning came. I packed one small suitcase. At JFK, I handed over the ticket no one else wanted. The flight was long, the train ride longer. The mountains of France rose like ancient witnesses as the countryside blurred past the window. I thought of Richard's childhood laugh, his graduation, his wedding day. I thought of how silence had shaped my life. When the train stopped at a small station, the platform was nearly empty. My shoes echoed on the worn boards, and then I saw him, an elderly driver in a crisp black suit, holding a sign with my name written carefully. I approached, hesitant. He looked at me with eyes startlingly bright and said 5, words that stopped my heart. "Etienne has been waiting forever." My knees weakened. Etienne. A name I had not spoken in 50 years. A name I thought buried with my youth in Paris. A name that could change everything I thought I knew about my son. And about myself. I have lived long enough to know that grief can take many shapes. Sometimes it arrives like a tidal wave, violent and impossible to resist. Other times it seeps into the smallest cracks of silence, hollowing a person from the inside. After Richard's funeral, I discovered a third form, grief wrapped in indifference. It was colder than rain, sharper than any knife, and it cut me in ways no one could see. All my life I had given. I gave when my husband, Daniel, passed away far too young, leaving me to raise a boy who still needed bedtime stories. I gave when I worked double shifts at the school, grading papers by candlelight after the power company threatened to cut the lights. I gave when I sold my wedding ring to help Richard pay for textbooks at Columbia. Every sacrifice felt small compared to the joy of watching my son rise. I thought it was enough, but at the cemetery, no one looked at me as if I mattered. I was background scenery, a quiet shadow to be tolerated rather than honored. Vivian had curated the entire ceremony, every flower, every word spoken, every carefully photographed tear. She greeted the mourners as if she were chairing a gala, her voice smooth, her posture flawless. The air smelled not of mourning but of her perfume, expensive and artificial. When the pastor closed his book, she did not bow her head. She scanned the crowd, searching not for God but for attention. I stood by myself, clutching a simple black umbrella that dripped on my shoes. Not a single person crossed the grass to take my hand. My son's body was lowered into the ground, and still I remained invisible. The reception at the penthouse only deepened the wound. Vivian floated through the rooms like a queen, her court trailing behind in designer heels. The chandeliers sparkled, glasses clinked, and laughter rose in defiance of the coffin we had left barely an hour earlier. People complimented the canapes, the floral arrangements, even the view of Central Park. No one asked about Richard's childhood or his favorite books or the summers we spent by the shore. They asked Vivian how she was holding up, as though her grief deserved applause while mine was irrelevant. And then came Samuel Pierce. I had known him only briefly, but Richard had trusted him with his business affairs. He was a kind man, polite, with a lawyer's calm dignity. Yet even he bent beneath Vivian's will. I saw it in the way he hesitated before announcing the will would be read that very night, as if he himself felt the timing was indecent. Vivian's insistence silenced his reluctance. Her smile, perfectly practiced, left no room for protest. I remember sitting in the corner watching him shuffle his papers. My heart beat so loudly I could hear it over the clatter of crystal glasses. And then the words fell, heavy and final. Vivian inherited everything. The penthouse, the shares, the yacht, the estates. When the crumpled envelope was placed in my hand, I felt the heat of dozens of eyes waiting for me to be humiliated. I opened it because there was no other choice. Their laughter when they saw the plane ticket rang louder than the pastor's prayer at the graveside. I wanted to scream, to tell them who I was, that I had been the one who held Richard's hand through childhood fevers, who stood in gymnasiums for his first debates, who drove across states just to hear him deliver a keynote speech, that I had once been the center of his world, not an afterthought to be dismissed with mockery, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by years of practice in staying quiet. Instead, I reached for the handkerchief in my pocket. It was small, almost forgotten. White cotton, embroidered with a single letter, O. I had stitched it myself when I was a girl, long before marriage, long before motherhood. The fabric was worn thin from years of folding and refolding. As their laughter swelled, I pressed the handkerchief into my palm until my knuckles whitened. It was the only thing that kept my tears from spilling in front of them. That piece of cloth became my anchor. In its threads lived the girl I used to be, the woman I had become, and perhaps the strength I would need to endure what lay ahead. While they mocked, while Vivian celebrated her victory in stilettos and silk, I held on. The world could strip me of dignity in public, but it could not take away the quiet resolve stitched into that single letter. I sat there invisible as conversations rose around me. Julian leaned too close to Vivian, their laughter intimate, careless. Friends toasted with white wine as though the gathering was nothing more than an after-work party. And Samuel, poor Samuel, kept glancing at me with pity he did not dare express aloud. He was bound by his duty, trapped like me in the theater Vivian had orchestrated. The realization cut deeper than any inheritance document. I was not just overlooked. I was treated as if I were obsolete, a relic from another time, tolerated until the ground claimed me as well. My sacrifices, my devotion, my entire life, reduced to an envelope that no one believed contained meaning. But grief has a way of sharpening clarity. As I clutched my handkerchief, I began to see through the glittering surfaces around me. Vivian's control was not strength, but fear disguised as power. Samuel's hesitation showed he still carried decency, even if muted, and my silence, which they mistook for weakness, was in truth the only shield I had left. When I finally left the penthouse, the city lights blurred through the rain. My shoes echoed on the marble floor of the lobby, each step carrying me away from their laughter. I slipped into the back of a taxi, the envelope heavy in my lap, the handkerchief damp in my fist. Invisible, yes. Outdated, yes, but not finished. As the taxi pulled into the wet night, I whispered a single vow to myself. If my son had left me only this ticket, then he must have had his reasons, and I would follow where it led, even if the world thought I was nothing more than an old woman past her worth. For the first time that day, I felt the faintest spark of something other than grief. Not joy, not yet, but the whisper of a possibility. And still, I kept the handkerchief in my palm, its threads binding me to memory and endurance. The cab dropped me off in Queens just past midnight. The streets were slick with rain, neon lights reflecting in broken puddles. I climbed the narrow steps to my apartment, each foot heavier than the last. When I opened the door, the familiar smell of old paper and chamomile greeted me. My life, distilled into secondhand furniture, sagging shelves of books, and a kettle stained from decades of use. I placed the envelope on the small kitchen table and hung my coat on the same chair I had leaned on for years. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Silence was not new to me. I had lived with it for decades, but tonight it pressed against my chest differently, as if daring me to break. I filled the kettle and waited for it to boil, my hands trembling from cold and something deeper. When the tea was steeped, I sat down and placed the cup beside the envelope. The steam rose for a few seconds before fading into nothing, just as my son's presence had faded from my life. I stared at the ticket. One slip of paper, Paris to Lyon, then a regional train to some obscure town whose name I struggled to pronounce. This was all I had been given, all my son had left me. The question was simple. Should I take it or should I fight? The thought of fighting lit a brief fire. Contest the will, hire a lawyer, demand recognition. I could march into court armed with the truth of a mother's sacrifice. I could recount every night I stayed awake to soothe Richard's fever. Every hour I worked extra shifts so he could have better shoes, better books, a better chance. I could show receipts, bank statements, the worn grooves in my hands from chalk dust and grocery bags. I could insist that motherhood is not a footnote. But then I saw Vivian's face in my mind, her smirk, her confidence, her ability to twist any truth into her narrative. She had wealth, lawyers, and a circle of admirers who believed every word she spoke. If I fought, she would not hesitate to smear me, to paint me as a bitter old woman chasing money. The court of public opinion would clap for her again, just as they had in the penthouse. The kettle clicked as it cooled, pulling me back to the present. I wrapped my hands around the cup of tea. The warmth seeped into my skin, but inside I still felt cold. As I sipped, memories surfaced unbidden. Richard at 6, sitting cross-legged on the floor with picture books scattered around him. "Mom, I'm going to invent something that changes the world," he declared, his eyes blazing with certainty. Richard at 14, taller than me already, clutching his debate trophy. "You see, Mom, I told you hard work pays off." Richard at 22, in his cap and gown, pulling me into a hug so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "I'll take care of you one day, Mom. You won't have to worry about anything." Each memory was both a balm and a blade. My sacrifices had not been in vain. He had risen just as I had hoped, but had he forgotten? Or had he known in those final days that the only thing left he could give me was not money or property, but a path toward something else? I looked at the ticket again. Perhaps it was a cruel joke. Or perhaps it was the last gift of a son who understood that his mother had been unseen for too long and wanted her to see something she had missed. The city outside was restless. Sirens wailed, car horns blared, life moved as though my son's death was irrelevant. But in that tiny kitchen, the world paused. I pulled the handkerchief from my pocket, the one with the letter O stitched in white thread. I pressed it against my lips, breathing into it as though it might answer me. That handkerchief had dried Richard's tears once, long ago, when he scraped his knee. It had absorbed my tears at Daniel's funeral. It had endured. I whispered aloud, surprising myself. "What do you want from me, Richard?" There was no reply, only the faint ticking of the old wall clock, but something inside me stirred. Perhaps the answer had already been given, not through words, but through the simple act of leaving me this journey. The temptation to stay rooted in my anger was strong. Anger is loud, and it can feel like strength, but I knew anger would not heal me. It would only consume me. Vivian would want me to stay, to waste what little time I had left in bitter fights. Perhaps Richard wanted the opposite, for me to leave, to discover, to reclaim something of my own before it was too late. I thought of the laughter in that penthouse, the sting of being dismissed as obsolete. I thought of how no one looked at me as someone who mattered. Then I thought of the driver in the rain, holding a sign with my name. He was waiting. Someone was waiting. I lifted the ticket, smoothed the wrinkles with my palm. Its edges were worn, but the print was clear. Tomorrow morning, a seat reserved for me. A journey meant only for me. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I could choose to fight, to scream, to demand justice in their world. Or I could choose silence, my silence, the kind that is not weakness, but power, the kind that would carry me across an ocean. When I opened my eyes, the decision had been made. I folded the handkerchief neatly, slipped it back into my pocket, and placed the ticket on top of my suitcase. My body felt lighter, though the grief was still there. It would always be there. But alongside it now was a fragile thread of resolve. I finished the last of the tea, now cold, and washed the cup carefully, as though it mattered to leave the kitchen tidy. The act steadied me. I turned off the lights, letting the room rest in darkness. Tomorrow I will go, not to fight, not to prove myself to people who never saw me, but to honor the son who had trusted me with this strange inheritance. I would step into the unknown, guided only by silence and the strength I had carried all my life. And so, without witnesses, without applause, I made the quiet choice that would change everything. I would leave. The morning I left New York, the city seemed strangely indifferent to my departure. The yellow cabs still honked, the sidewalks still overflowed with hurried feet, and Times Square glowed even at dawn, as though nothing had shifted in the world. Yet for me, everything had shifted. I carried a single suitcase and a single piece of paper, the ticket my son had left me. It was the only map I had, and I clung to it as if it were a lifeline. The airport was a blur of fluorescent lights and announcements echoing through the terminals. I shuffled through the security line, shoes off, coat folded, all the while clutching the small envelope in my purse. Other passengers rushed past me, their lives full of urgency, their destinations known and chosen. Mine was neither. On the plane to Paris, I pressed my forehead against the small window. The city lights of New York stretched below me like veins of fire, then vanished into the dark ocean. Somewhere out there, between continents, I began to feel the true weight of what I was doing. I was leaving behind everything I had known, my apartment in Queens, my routines, even the graves that held my husband and I thought my son. The seat beside me was empty. In that empty seat, I saw the outline of my loneliness. The flight attendants smiled politely, their voices soft, but every kindness reminded me of how invisible I felt at home. Here I was not dismissed. I was simply another traveler, anonymous, and somehow that was easier to bear. I sipped the lukewarm coffee they offered and tried to rest, but my thoughts wandered. At dawn, the plane descended through heavy clouds, and France appeared beneath me. Patches of farmland, winding rivers, clusters of rooftops with orange tiles. Paris looked smaller from above than I remembered, but no less beautiful. My chest tightened with memory. I had been here once, a lifetime ago, when I was 20. A study abroad program, a single year that changed me in ways no one at home ever understood. The streets of Paris had awakened me then. The smell of fresh bread at dawn, the sound of church bells rolling across rooftops, the endless conversations in cafes where time seemed to stretch. And there had been someone. Etienne. The name floated up, unbidden, like a forgotten melody. I pressed it, back down, unwilling to let it distract me. He belonged to the past. The airport was crowded, but unlike New York's chaos, this crowd moved with a rhythm that felt almost graceful. I followed the signs to the train station. My ticket directed me not to stay in Paris, but to continue southeast, toward Lyon, and then further into the mountains. I felt like a stranger being led by invisible hands. On the train to Lyon, I sat by the window again. Fields rolled past, dotted with cows and farmhouses. Vineyards stretched across hills like green quilts stitched by patient hands. Occasionally, a church spire pierced the horizon, reminding me of the centuries that had passed before my own small life began. The rhythm of the train lulled me into memory. I remembered arriving in Paris as a girl, my heart full of hope and nerves. I had carried a notebook everywhere, filling it with sketches of bridges, scribbles of poems, and fragments of French phrases. One rainy afternoon in a library, my pencil broke, and a young man sitting across the table offered me his. His name was Etienne. He had eyes the color of the Seine at dusk, and a smile that made me forget my own awkwardness. We had talked for hours, then days, then months. He showed me the hidden corners of the city, the quiet courtyards where ivy crept up stone walls, the small cafes where the owner knew his order by heart. We shared secrets, dreams, and promises too fragile to survive in the real world. I returned to America when the year ended, believing it was only goodbye for a season. But then came a letter, and then silence. And then the news that he had been killed in an accident, or so I had been told. The train swayed gently, and I closed my eyes. The name Etienne lingered in my mind, unsettling, impossible to shake. Why now? Why did my son's final instructions lead me back to this country, back toward the ghosts I had locked away for decades? At Lyon, I changed trains. The platform was quiet, the announcement softer, the station lined with stone instead of glass. I felt the distance from Paris immediately. Travelers here were fewer, their voices lower, their clothes practical. I boarded the regional train with a sense that I was moving deeper into something not just geographical, but personal. The carriage was nearly empty. I chose a seat facing backward, so the landscape rolled away from me like pages turning in reverse. Mountains rose in the distance, snow clinging to their peaks. The valleys were green and damp, dotted with cottages and small villages where smoke curled from chimneys. Life here seemed slower, older, untouched by the speed of the world I had left behind. As the train wound through the countryside, I thought of Richard again. What had he discovered that brought me here? Why a village in the Alps? Why not leave me a key, or a letter, or even one kind word? Why only a ticket? I touched the handkerchief in my pocket, the embroidered O pressed against my fingertips. It had become more than cloth. It was the thread binding my past to my present. The silence of the carriage amplified my thoughts until they filled the space like thunder. The train slowed as it entered a tunnel, the darkness pressing against the windows. At that moment, I whispered the name I had not spoken aloud in 50 years. Etienne. The sound startled me. It was as though I had summoned him from the shadows. When the train emerged into the light again, I caught my reflection in the glass. An old woman stared back at me, her hair silver, her eyes lined with years of sacrifice. Yet beneath that, for just a moment, I glimpsed the girl who had once walked through Paris with a notebook and a beating heart. The name stayed with me, hovering like a question I could not answer. Perhaps Richard had wanted me to remember. Perhaps this journey was not about inheritance or revenge, but about something more. Something I had lost long before Vivian ever entered our lives. The conductor announced the next stop in rapid French. I did not understand every word, but I understood enough to know that I was drawing closer. Closer to the village, closer to the reason behind the ticket, closer to the secret my son had left for me. As the train curved along the edge of a river, I pressed my palm to the window. The glass was cold, grounding. The world outside blurred, but inside me, something was sharpening. I could not name it yet, but I felt it. I was no longer just a grieving mother. I was a traveler again, a seeker, and the path, however strange, was leading me back to a name I thought I had buried with my youth. Etienne. The train pressed on toward the mountains, and I held my breath, waiting to see what waited for me in the silence ahead. The train screeched to a halt, its wheels grinding against the rails as though reluctant to let me go. I gathered my small suitcase and stepped into the aisle. The other passengers hurried past, eager to reach their destinations. I moved slowly, as though each step carried me deeper into a story I had not agreed to read. When the doors opened, a rush of cold air swept in. I descended the narrow steps, and the first thing I noticed was the quiet. The platform was nearly empty. A light drizzle fell, blurring the outlines of the mountains in the distance. The station itself was modest, more a shelter than a building, its stone walls streaked with moss. A single clock ticked above the entrance, its hands frozen just past 3. I felt the damp settle into my bones. New York's noise had followed me across the ocean, yet here silence reigned, broken only by the hiss of the departing train. I stood, unsure of what to do next. The ticket still folded in my coat pocket like a riddle with no answer. Then I saw him. An older man stood at the far end of the platform. His suit was black but well pressed, his shoes polished though damp from the drizzle. In his hands he held a small placard. On it, written in neat block letters, was my name, Madame Olivia Hartman. My breath caught. I was expecting it. I approached cautiously, my suitcase rattling against the uneven boards. The man straightened as I neared, his posture respectful, his eyes kind but unreadable. He tipped his hat slightly, the gesture formal, almost old-fashioned. "Madame Hartman," he said, his voice touched with a French accent, deep and deliberate. Yes, I replied. My own voice sounded strange, as though it belonged to someone else. He held my gaze, then spoke 5 words that stopped the world around me. Etienne has been waiting forever. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. The drizzle pattered on the roof. The mountains loomed in the mist, and the name I had not spoken aloud in half a century echoed back at me. Etienne, the suitcase slipped slightly from my grasp. My knees weakened, my lips parted, but no words came. The driver did not waver. He repeated the name with quiet certainty, as though it were as natural as saying the weather. Etienne. My mind spun backward, unraveling the decades in an instant. Paris, the library on Rue de Richelieu, a broken pencil and a young man's hand offering me his own. Etienne, the architecture student with eyes like twilight water. Etienne, who carried my books when the rain was too heavy. Etienne, who whispered in a mixture of French and English that the world was larger than I dared believe. We had walked the Seine together, traced our initials into the bark of a tree in the Luxembourg Gardens, and spoken of futures that felt eternal. He had kissed me once under the Pont Neuf, and I thought then that life would always be so wide, so endless. And then the letter came, a letter saying there had been an accident, that Etienne was gone, that my youth in Paris was over. For 50 years I had lived with that truth, or what I thought was true. Now, on this deserted platform, an old driver was telling me otherwise. I swallowed hard, the drizzle mixing with the tears I had not realized were falling. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Etienne has been waiting," he said again, more gently this time, as though aware of the storm he had unleashed inside me. I could not move. The ground felt unsteady beneath me. Could it be possible? Could the man I thought dead still live? And if he lived, what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about my life? About Richard? The driver reached for my suitcase with quiet courtesy. "Please, madame, the car is ready." I let him take it, my hands shaking too much to resist. He guided me toward a black sedan parked beside the station. Its headlights cut faint beams through the mist. As we drove away, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. The countryside unfolded in muted greens and grays, rain tracing rivers across the window. But I saw none of it. My mind was trapped in the past. Etienne, his laughter, deep and unguarded, his sketches of bridges and buildings scattered across cafe tables, his promise that he would follow me to America, a promise broken by tragedy, or so I had believed. What if he had not died? What if the story I had been told was a lie or a misunderstanding or something more? What if the love I had lost was not lost at all? And then came the sharper thought, the one that stole my breath. What if Etienne was Richard's father? I closed my eyes. Richard's face flashed before me. His dark hair, his sharp jaw, the way he leaned forward when he was passionate about an idea. How many times had people told me he looked older than his years, that he carried himself with a kind of European grace? I had always dismissed it. But now... The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "It is not far," he said softly. I wanted to ask 100 questions. Where was Etienne? How long had he known I was coming? Why had Richard sent me here? But my tongue was heavy, my thoughts tangled. Instead, I remained silent, gripping the handkerchief in my pocket until the threads cut into my palm. Silence has always been my armor. Tonight, it was my only weapon. The road climbed into the foothills, winding past vineyards and stone cottages. The mist thickened, cloaking the world in secrecy. My heart pounded, each beat a mix of fear and longing. At last, the driver turned down a narrow lane lined with towering cypress trees, their branches arched overhead like guardians. At the end of the lane, through the fog, I glimpsed the outline of a chateau. Its turrets rose against the gray sky, its windows glowing faintly with light. The car stopped before tall iron gates. The driver stepped out, opened my door, and said simply, "We have arrived." I stood on the gravel, the drizzle cooling my flushed cheeks. My eyes fixed on the chateau beyond the gates, its silhouette, both welcoming and foreboding. Etienne. The name pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. If he truly lived, then my past had not ended. It had been waiting for me all along. And if he was alive, then perhaps Richard had known. Perhaps this was why he had left me the ticket. Perhaps he had wanted me to find the truth I had buried with my youth. I drew the handkerchief from my pocket and pressed it to my lips. The letter O gleamed faintly in the dim light, a reminder of the girl I had once been and the woman I had become. I whispered into the mist, barely daring to breathe the words, "Etienne." The gates creaked open. The driver gestured for me to follow, and though my legs trembled, I stepped forward. With each step, memory and reality merged. I was no longer just Olivia Hartman, the widow, the forgotten mother. I was also Olivia, the young woman who had once believed in love strong enough to outlast oceans. The drizzle turned to rain, the gravel crunched beneath my shoes, and somewhere inside that chateau was the answer to a question I had not asked in half a century. And still the driver's words echoed in my ears, relentless and undeniable. Etienne has been waiting forever. The iron gates swung shut behind us with a hollow clang that echoed in the mist. The car rolled slowly down the gravel drive, tires crunching against the stones, each sound amplified by the silence of the mountains. I sat stiffly in the back seat, my hands folded over the handkerchief in my lap. My pulse beat against the thin fabric like a trapped bird. When the fog parted, the chateau emerged. Chateau Beaumont. That was the name the driver finally whispered when I asked. It stood proud against the mountainside, its stone walls streaked with centuries of rain, its turrets rising into the clouds. It was not enormous, not like the castles in guidebooks, but it carried an undeniable dignity, as if it had endured storms and wars and heartbreaks and still refused to crumble. Ivy clung to its sides, climbing with the patience of time. Lanterns glowed faintly at the entrance, casting halos of light against the damp air. Vineyards stretched below, rows of vines twisting across the hillsides like dark green veins. Even in the drizzle, the leaves glistened. I imagined how they would look in summer, heavy with fruit, the air rich with the smell of grapes. Life had been cultivated here, tended, nurtured. My chest tightened at the thought. The car came to a stop before broad stone steps. The driver stepped out and opened my door, offering his hand. My legs were unsteady as I rose, my shoes sinking slightly into the wet gravel. The mist swirled, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. And then, as if drawn by the sound of arrival, a figure appeared in the doorway. At first I could only see the outline, tall, slightly stooped, framed by the glow of lantern light. But when he stepped forward, the air left my lungs. His hair was silver now, swept back from a forehead marked by time. His face bore the lines of decades, carved deeply by laughter and sorrow alike. Yet his eyes, those eyes, remained unchanged, clear, steady, the same twilight hue I had once compared to the Seine at dusk. I would have known them anywhere. Etienne, I gripped the handkerchief tighter, pressing it into my palm until the stitches bit into my skin. For 42 years, I had believed he was gone. For 42 years, I had buried every memory, convincing myself that what we had was a chapter lost to tragedy. And now he stood only a few steps away, as real as the rain falling on my shoulders. He did not speak, neither did I. Words seemed impossible, clumsy in the weight of that moment. Instead, we looked at one another, and in his gaze I saw a mirror of my own shock, my own grief, my own wonder. The drizzle blurred my vision, but I knew some of the wetness on my cheeks was not from the rain. My lips parted, but no sound emerged. I could not ask the questions that burned inside me. Why did you not come for me? Why did you let me believe you were dead? Why am I here now, after everything? He descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt suspended between two lives, the one I had lived and the one I might have had if not for that letter so many years ago. When he reached the final step, he paused as though giving me permission to choose, to step forward or to turn away. I stayed rooted, trembling, unable to move closer, unable to retreat. The silence between us grew heavy, but it was not hostile. It was thick with unspoken truths, with years lost and memories preserved. I felt them all pressing around me. The afternoons in Paris cafes, the promises whispered in broken French and English, the kiss beneath Pont Neuf, the way he once held my hand as if the world could vanish and we would still remain. And now here we were, older, bent but unbroken, standing in the rain like survivors of a war we had fought separately. He raised his hand slowly as if afraid I might flinch, but he did not touch me. He let his hand hover, a gesture of recognition rather than claim. His lips parted slightly, and though he still did not speak, his eyes said everything. I am here. I never left, not truly. I pressed the handkerchief to my lips to stifle the sob rising in my throat. My body shook, not from cold, but from the collapse of certainty. For so long I had thought my life was only about endurance, about carrying grief with dignity. But in that moment, I realized grief was not the whole of me. There was still a pulse of youth inside, still a memory of being seen, cherished, chosen. 42 years had not erased it. I finally found my voice, though it was only a whisper. How? The single word carried all my questions. He shook his head slowly, rain sliding down his silver hair. His silence told me that the story was too large for this moment, that explanations would come later. For now, it was enough that we both stood here, alive, in the same place again. The driver cleared his throat softly, reminding us both of his presence. Etienne gestured toward the open doors of the chateau, the warm glow spilling out into the mist. I nodded faintly and allowed the driver to lift my suitcase once more. As I climbed the stone steps, my knees unsteady, I felt Etienne's gaze follow me. Not possessive, not demanding, but steady. As if to anchor me to the ground, I felt slipping beneath my feet. Inside, the air was warm, smelling faintly of oak and old wine. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors faded but dignified. A fire crackled faintly in the hearth, its light reflecting off polished floors. Everything here spoke of endurance, of history that had not crumbled even as centuries passed. I stood in the entry hall, unable to remove my coat, unable to move further. Etienne entered behind me, closing the door softly against the rain. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I turned at last to face him fully. My heart ached with 1,000 words I could not say. But when his eyes met mine, something inside me loosened. We were no longer two strangers bound by the ghost of memory. We were two souls who had survived, scarred but still present, standing in the only truth that mattered, that we had once loved, and that love had not been erased. 42 years of silence cracked open in that quiet hall, yet still, we said nothing. The silence itself was our language, and it spoke louder than words. I pressed the handkerchief once more to my lips, and in the faint warmth of the chateau, I felt the buried part of me stir awake. I sat across from Etienne in a study that smelled faintly of cedar and old books. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, though the spring air outside was mild. My shoes had been set neatly beside the sofa where I had fainted earlier. Someone, likely the loyal driver, had tucked a blanket around me. It was a small kindness that made the room feel less foreign, less daunting. Yet nothing could soften what Etienne was about to say. His eyes, lined with age but still alight with the same brilliance I remembered from Paris, held mine with both hesitation and gravity. "Olivia," he began, his voice still carrying that soft French cadence that once made my younger heart stutter. "Your son, Richard, came to me." The words struck me like a physical blow. My hands, clasping the embroidered handkerchief with the faded letter O, trembled. For a moment I thought I had misheard, that grief was making me hallucinate. But Etienne's expression left no doubt. "Richard found me months ago," he continued, his gaze steady though his throat tightened. "He had questions only I could answer. He had done a test, DNA. He wanted the truth." I could not breathe. My son, so private, so composed in the face of everything, he had gone searching, and he had discovered what I had buried for 42 years, that Thomas, the husband who raised him with quiet devotion, was not his biological father. I pressed the handkerchief hard against my lips to stifle the sound that threatened to escape. Etienne's voice softened. He was angry at first, but once he looked into my eyes, once he saw his own reflection there, he understood, he forgave. He said Thomas was a good man, a good father, but he wished he had known the whole of his story. My heart constricted with equal parts shame and relief. I had wanted to protect Richard from that truth, convinced that silence was a form of love. But my silence had sent him searching alone. Then Etienne leaned forward, his expression darkening. But Olivia, it was not only paternity he sought. He came because he no longer trusted the woman he had married. I blinked, stunned. Vivian? He nodded grimly. Richard suspected infidelity. He hired private investigators. They confirmed his fears. Vivian was entangled with Julian, his business partner. But there was more, far worse. They uncovered irregularities, missing funds, shell companies offshore. Patterns are too deliberate to be mere mistakes. A chill ran down my spine. The yacht accident, the rushed will reading, the casual cruelty at the funeral, it all began to arrange itself into a horrifying pattern. He feared, Etienne said slowly, that Vivian and Julian were plotting not only to take his company, but his life. He told me directly, with eyes clear as glass, that if he died suddenly, it would not be a chance. It would not be a misfortune. It would be murder. The room seemed to close in around me. I remembered Vivian's laughter at the will reading, sharp as shattered crystal. I remembered Julian's hand resting on her knee as though Richard had never existed. And I remembered the envelope pressed into my hands, the ticket to France everyone had mocked. My breath came ragged. Then why leave everything to her? Why humiliate me so? Etienne shook his head gently. Because it was a mask, Olivia. Richard crafted a double plan, a facade for Vivian, to keep her arrogant, unsuspecting, and a path for you, the plane ticket, to lead you here, to me. He wanted her to believe she had already won, so she would grow careless. And he wanted you to hold the key to the truth. The key. My hand tightened on the envelope still tucked in my bag, as if it contained something more than a simple ticket. It was a signal, a passage, a silent inheritance of trust. Etienne stood, walked to an old oak desk and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were copies of documents Richard had given him, financial records, signed affidavits, encrypted drives. Your son, he said with quiet pride, was meticulous. He left me this to safeguard. He told me, if anything should happen, you must come to France. Only then would the truth be revealed. Only then would justice begin. I stared at the pages, the numbers blurring with my tears. My son, my boy I thought I had lost, had planned even for this. He had not abandoned me with scraps. He had trusted me with everything that mattered. Olivia, Etienne said, his voice breaking for the first time. Richard was certain. His death on that boat was not an accident. He told me so himself, only 3 days before it happened. The world tilted again, not from fainting, but from the unbearable weight of truth. My son had died knowing betrayal was close, danger closer, and the only lifeline he left was a crumpled envelope and the 5 words from Etienne's driver, Etienne has been waiting forever. I clutched the handkerchief until my knuckles ached. For decades I had believed silence was safe, but Richard had turned silence into strategy, and now it was my turn to decide whether to remain the invisible widow in the background or to step forward, holding my son's final plan like a torch against the darkness. Etienne rose from his chair by the fire with the slow certainty of a man carrying something fragile. His hands, though strong even in age, trembled faintly as he opened a drawer in the oak desk. When he turned back toward me, I saw the envelope in his grasp. It was not crumpled like the one I'd carried from New York, but carefully preserved. the paper thick and cream-colored, sealed with a smudge of wax. He placed it gently in my hands. "Richard asked me to keep this safe," he said. "He told me you would come, that I must wait to give it only to you." My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would drown out his words. I stared at the handwriting on the front of the envelope. Unmistakably Richard's, bold strokes from years of signing contracts, but softened by something deeply personal. It was addressed simply, "To my mother." My fingers shook as I broke the seal. The paper unfolded with a whisper, and my son's voice seemed to rise from the page, crossing the distance between life and death. "Dearest Mom, if you are reading this, it means things happened the way I feared, and it means you had the courage to follow the path I left for you. Please forgive me. What I am about to say may feel cruel, but every cruelty was a mask. Every humiliation, every moment that made you appear forgotten was part of a shield I needed to build." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I pressed the handkerchief to my cheek, absorbing the tears with its faded threads. This time I did not hide behind it. I let the tears come, not as weakness, but as proof that I was still alive, still carrying his voice. "I'm sorry for the scene at the reading. I asked Samuel to deliver only that crumpled envelope, knowing Vivian and her circle would laugh. I knew it would cut you deeply, and that is the part I regret. I had to make you invisible in their eyes, because only then would they let down their guard. I had to make you look small, so that you could move unseen. What I gave you was not rejection. It was the only key that could unlock the truth." My throat closed around a sob. I had replayed that moment in Manhattan over and over, wondering how my son could leave me with nothing. Now, reading his confession, I understood. It was a strategy, a brutal one, but born of love. Vivian and Julian are not who they pretend to be. I discovered their betrayal slowly, first in whispers, then in numbers on a page, money that vanished, contracts that never should have been signed, and finally, photographs, proof of their affair, proof of their alliance against me. I knew the danger. I knew my days might be counted, but I also knew they would never suspect you. To them, you are the forgotten widow of a forgotten man. To me, you are the strongest shield I have ever known. I pressed the letter to my chest. My shoulders shook, but not with shame. His words burned away the weight of invisibility I had carried for decades. Forgotten? No. To my son, I had been the anchor, the quiet constant he trusted when the world turned against him. I chose France because there was someone there you needed to see, someone you once loved, someone who can give you both truth and strength. Etienne knows the whole of it now. He will guide you. But this journey is not only about him and not only about me. It is about you. You must believe that your story does not end in a penthouse full of strangers mocking you. Your story continues here in the mountains where silence can turn into power. I looked up at Etienne, who stood with his head bowed, his silver hair catching the firelight. My chest swelled with a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. Richard had brought me back to this man, not for romance, not for nostalgia, but for truth and survival. I returned my gaze to the letter. Mom, if you had not taken that ticket, if you had chosen to stay in Queens, everything would have been lost. The evidence, the legacy, the chance to stop them. Vivian would have buried me twice, once in the sea and once in silence. But because you are here, it means the chain is unbroken. Please hold steady. Everything that matters now rests with you. The handkerchief trembled in my grip. For the first time, I did not press it to my face to hide. I dabbed my tears with it calmly, steadily, almost with pride. These tears were not a collapse. They were a baptism into something new, an inheritance of strength. One last thing. Do not let anyone tell you silence is weakness. You taught me otherwise. When I was a boy, you endured so much without complaint. You let actions speak louder than words. I carry that with me even now, and it is why I trust you, because you will know when to remain quiet and when to act. You always have. I could barely see the page now. My vision swam with tears that refused to stop. But I did not fight them. I let them flow because each word was carving away the years of doubt and invisibility that had pressed me into the margins of my own life. If you still have the handkerchief with the letter O, keep it close. Let it remind you of who you are. Not just my mother, not just the widow of Thomas, but Olivia, strong, enduring, and seen. With all my love, Richard. I lowered the letter slowly, my hands trembling but firm. The fire crackled, filling the silence between us. Etienne did not speak, did not intrude. He simply watched, his gaze steady, as though guarding me in this fragile moment. I pressed the handkerchief against my eyes, the embroidered O warm against my skin. For decades, I had used it to hide tears. Tonight, I used it to wipe them away, to show myself that I was still standing. The silence in the room deepened, no longer heavy with sorrow, but charged with purpose. My son had given me more than a letter. He had given me back myself. I folded the paper carefully, returning it to the envelope. My hand lingered on the wax seal, broken now but still bearing his mark. Then I looked up at Etienne and whispered, with a steadiness I had not felt in years, "I will not fail him." And for the first time since stepping off the train, I believed it. When Etienne finished speaking, when the letter had been folded and placed back into my trembling hands, the fire in the chateau's hearth had burned low. Outside, the mist pressed against the tall windows, shrouding the vineyards in secrecy. For a long time, I sat motionless, staring at the glowing embers, listening to the silence stretch between us. Silence, but not emptiness. The silence now carried weight. It carried Richard's voice, his instructions, his trust. At last I whispered, "We must go back to Cape Cod." Etienne inclined his head, as though he had known all along this would be my conclusion. "Yes," he said softly, "that is where he told me you would find what you need." Cape Cod, the summer house. My chest tightened at the thought. That house was more than a property. It was a living memory, a container of our lives. Daniel had bought it when Richard was only 10, saying we needed a place where the ocean could teach our boy about strength and patience. Summers there had been simple. Sand in our shoes, salt in our hair, laughter carried on the wind. Even after Daniel died, Richard and I had kept going. We painted the porch together, fixed the squeaky screen door, and collected shells we never threw away. That house was ours, and now Richard had chosen it as the hiding place for the truth. We left the chateau at dawn 2 days later, traveling quietly, discreetly. Etienne arranged the flights and handled the details with the calm efficiency of a man who had lived with secrets before. I kept Richard's letter close to my chest and the handkerchief in my pocket. My silence felt sharper now, no longer the silence of invisibility, but the silence of resolve. When the plane touched down in Boston, the air smelled different, saltier, harsher. The sky was overcast, the Atlantic restless even from a distance. We rented a car and drove toward the Cape, the roads narrowing, the towns thinning until at last the familiar curve of the coast appeared. My heart beat faster with each mile, both in longing and in dread. The summer house stood just as I remembered, perched on the edge of a bluff where waves crashed relentlessly below. Its white paint was weathered, the shutters peeling from years of storms, but the sight of it made my throat ache. Memories poured in. Richard chasing gulls down the beach, Daniel teaching him to fish, the three of us eating clam chowder on the porch as the sun set. I gripped the handkerchief, pressing it into my palm, willing myself not to drown in nostalgia. But something was wrong. The front gate hung open, swaying in the wind. The gravel drive was scarred with fresh tire tracks. My stomach dropped. Etienne's hand tightened on the wheel. "We are not the first," he murmured. We pulled to a stop beside the porch steps. The screen door banged loosely against its frame, broken from the latch. My breath caught. I knew that door. Richard and I had fixed it together. It would never have been left like that. I stepped out, the wind whipping my hair, the sound of the ocean a roar in my ears. My feet crunched on scattered shards of glass near the porch. A window had been broken. "Olivia," Etienne said gently, but I was already moving forward, my pulse hammering. Inside, chaos awaited. Cushions torn open, books ripped from shelves, drawers overturned. The house that had once been filled with laughter and seashells was now a wreck. My knees threatened to give way. Each object desecrated was a wound, each memory defiled. And then I heard it. Voices. From the back of the house, muffled but distinct. A woman's sharp tone, a man's low murmur in reply. I froze, my heart slamming. Etienne placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his eyes warning me to be still. We moved quietly down the hall, the floorboards creaking under our cautious steps. The voices grew clearer. In the dining room, lit by the gray light seeping through cracked blinds, Vivian stood with her back to us, rifling through a box of old photographs. Julian hovered near the sideboard, tossing aside ledgers, his jaw tight with frustration. "Damn him!" Vivian hissed, flinging a photo to the floor. "He must have hidden it here. He wouldn't just walk away. Richard was always too clever." Julian swore under his breath, shoving papers into a pile. "If we don't find it soon, everything collapses. We can't cover the transfers forever." I pressed my fist to my mouth to stifle the sound rising in my throat. My son was right. He had known. Vivian straightened suddenly, her voice slicing through the air. "We will find it. And when we do, no one, not his mother, not anyone, will stand in our way." The bile rose in my throat. She said the word mother as though it were a nuisance, as though I were a shadow to be brushed aside. Rage flared in me, not loud, not reckless, but cold and steady. Etienne's hand remained on my shoulder, anchoring me. His eyes asked silently, "Wait or confront?" I shook my head faintly. Not yet. Richard's letter had told me to be silent until the time was right. Silence was my strength now. We backed away quietly, leaving them to tear apart the house that had once been sacred. Each step away felt like fire in my chest, but I forced myself to retreat. Outside, the wind nearly knocked me over, its salt sting mixing with the tears burning in my eyes. Etienne guided me to the car. "They are desperate," he said, his voice low. "That means we are close. Richard hid something here, and they have not yet found it. But we will." I nodded, clutching the handkerchief. The embroidered O was damp with tears, but my grip was unyielding. Vivian thought I was invisible, a relic to be discarded. She had no idea that invisibility could be armor. She had no idea that silence could hold the sharpest blade. As the waves crashed against the cliffs below, I whispered to myself words Richard had once told me as a boy when I feared the ocean's pull. "Mom, don't fight the waves. Let them carry you until you find your footing." I closed my eyes, inhaled the salt air, and steadied myself. The waves were carrying me now, carrying me toward the truth Richard had hidden, carrying me through the storm Vivian thought she commanded. The summer house was no longer only a memory. It had become a battlefield, and I would not leave until my son's voice was heard again. The morning after discovering Vivian and Julian had ransacked the summer house, Etienne and I returned under the cover of early light. The wind off the ocean was fierce, whipping the curtains of fog across the cliffs, bending the roses in the garden until their petals scattered on the ground like torn silk. That garden had been Richard's favorite place. He used to say the roses were more than flowers. They were guardians of the house, witnesses to our family's summers. Etienne guided me through the side path, his steps careful on the damp grass. We circled toward the garden where the stone bench sat, weathered but unyielding, shaped like an X across its seat. Richard and I had often sat there together, drinking lemonade, listening to the waves crash below. I had thought of it as simply a bench. But now, with Etienne's words echoing in my ears, I knew it was something more. Richard had hidden the evidence there. When we stepped into the clearing, Vivian was already waiting. She stood among the rose bushes in a tailored black coat, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. In her hand, she held a cigarette, though she did not smoke it. She simply let it burn, the ash growing long and fragile. Julian was nowhere in sight. She wanted this moment alone. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me, and a smile tugged at her painted lips. "Well, well," she said, her voice thick with mockery. "The ghost of queens herself. I suppose even relics can still wander." I said nothing. She exhaled a sharp laugh. "Tell me, Olivia, do you really think you matter? You're a poor old woman with nothing. You couldn't protect your husband, you couldn't keep your son, and now you come crawling back here as if Cape Cod will save you." She flicked the cigarette into the roses, its ember dying in the dew. "A poor old woman can do nothing, nothing at all." The words stung, but I did not let them pierce my silence. I only stepped closer, the handkerchief pressed in my fist, its threads steadying me. Vivian tilted her head, amused by what she thought was weakness. "What's wrong?" she taunted. "No witty reply, no desperate plea? That's all you've ever been, Olivia. Quiet, invisible, disposable." Her words tried to unmake me, but instead they confirmed what Richard had always known. Silence was not emptiness. Silence was strength. I lowered my gaze deliberately, as though bowing to her insult. My fingers brushed against the cool stone of the bench, tracing the faint groove in the shape of an X. I remembered Richard's laughter as a boy, running his small hands along that mark, asking why the bench looked so strange. I had told him it was just weathering. He must have known even then it could be more. Vivian crossed her arms. "Look at you. Cowering like always. I almost pity you." I pressed my palm firmly against the center of the X. There was a soft click. The sound startled her. She straightened, eyes narrowing as I lifted the stone panel hidden beneath the seat. Dust swirled in the morning air, and from within the hollow space, I drew out a lacquered box, deep blue with flecks of gold, an heirloom of truth. The box was heavier than it looked, its surface smooth and cool in my trembling hands. Vivian's smile faltered. She stepped forward quickly, her heels crunching on the gravel path. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice sharper now, the mockery stripped away. I did not answer. Her eyes darted from the box to my face, searching for weakness. "Give it to me," she ordered. Still, I remained silent. Her composure cracked. The mask of elegance she always wore began to slip. Her breath came faster. Her hands trembled, and the confidence that had carried her through the will reading and the mockery of the penthouse faltered. "You don't even know what's inside," she hissed. "You think Richard trusted you? He left you nothing but scraps." I clutched the box to my chest, the handkerchief pressed against it like a seal. My silence was no longer a shield, it was a blade. Every second I refused to respond, Vivian grew more unsteady. Her voice rose, shrill now. "You are nothing, Olivia, nothing!" Etienne stepped forward, his presence steady beside me, but I lifted a hand to stop him. This was mine to face. I looked at Vivian then, truly looked at her. The painted lips trembling, the eyes darting with fear, the desperate woman who had clawed her way into a life that was never hers, and still I did not speak. The silence stretched. It was unbearable for her. She lunged forward, reaching for the box, but her hand faltered at the last moment. My stillness unnerved her, made her stumble back as though struck. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Say something." But I would not. Richard's words in the letter echoed through me. "Do not let anyone tell you silence is weakness. You will know when to remain quiet and when to act." I lowered myself onto the bench, the box in my lap, my posture calm, unshaken. Vivian hovered in front of me, furious but lost, her control unraveling in the face of what she could not manipulate, my refusal to play her game. Etienne's voice finally broke the air, low and certain. "Madame Hartman is not alone." Vivian spun toward him, her face pale, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She knew she had overplayed her hand. The woman she believed invisible had just revealed the one thing she feared most, the truth Richard had hidden from her, the truth she could not control. The roses swayed in the wind, scattering petals across the ground, red against the pale gravel like drops of blood. The ocean roared below, its waves unrelenting, and I sat in silence, holding the box, knowing that for the first time in decades, the silence belonged to me. Vivian took a step back, her voice faltering into a whisper. "What are you going to do with it?" I lifted my eyes, steady and calm, though my lips never moved. She would not have my words. She would have only my silence. And in that silence, she stumbled again, powerless against the weight of what she could not break. For the first time, I saw her not as the victor, but as the desperate one. My silence had turned the tide, and I understood in that moment why Richard had trusted me with this path. Because sometimes the loudest justice is delivered not in shouts, but in silence. The box sat heavy in my lap, its lacquered surface cold against my palms as Vivian hovered before me like a cornered animal. Her bravado was gone. The smirk had dissolved into a twitch of panic at the corner of her mouth. She had expected me to scream, to beg, to crumble into dust as she reminded me of my place. Instead, I sat in silence, unyielding, and that silence became the sharpest blade between us. She opened her mouth to spit another insult, but the sound was drowned by the sudden crunch of tires on gravel. A black sedan rolled into the garden, its headlights slicing through the mist. Vivian spun around, her eyes wide. From the car stepped Samuel Pierce. His dark overcoat flared in the wind, his briefcase clutched like a shield. But he was not alone. Men and women followed behind him, their movements precise, their jackets marked not by fashion but by function. I recognized the bearing before I recognized the badges. Federal agents. Vivian's voice cracked as she tried to recover her composure. "Samuel, what is the meaning of this?" Samuel did not answer immediately. He glanced at me, then at the box in my lap. His gaze softened, and in that moment I knew he was not here to betray me. He was here to uphold the plan Richard had built. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but iron beneath. "Vivian Hartman, Julian Cross, you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder." Vivian laughed, high and brittle. "This is absurd. Richard is dead. There is no case. There is no—" Her words faltered when one of the agents stepped forward, a folder thick with documents in his hand. "We have the records," he said firmly. "Transfers, shell corporations, falsified reports, all traced back to you and Mr. Cross." Vivian's face was drained of color. She turned sharply toward Julian, who had just entered the garden from the house, his hands full of papers he had been rummaging through. His eyes met hers, and in that instant I saw it. The collapse of loyalty. The bond that had fueled their arrogance cracked under the weight of exposure. "You told me no one would find it," she hissed at him. Julian's jaw tightened. "You were supposed to destroy the trail," he snapped. They turned on each other like predators suddenly aware of the cage closing in. But Samuel's voice cut through their chaos. "Enough." He signaled to the agents, who moved forward with quiet precision. Vivian and Julian both stepped back, panic blooming across their faces. The garden, once their stage, had become their prison. I watched it unfold with a calm I could not have imagined days ago. For so long I had felt powerless, invisible. Now the truth was being carved into the open, and I was the silent witness Richard had trusted me to be. Then Samuel turned to me, his gaze holding a depth of something unspoken. "Mrs. Hartman," he said softly, "there is something you need to see." The agents shifted, forming a subtle barrier between Vivian and Julian, whose protests were swallowed by the wind. Samuel stepped closer, his briefcase opening with a click. Inside were more folders, sealed drives, evidence stacked like bricks in a wall against the lies that had tried to bury my son. But that was not what he wanted me to see. From the shadows near the hedges, a figure emerged. My breath caught. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step was weighted with years of absence. His hair was shorter than I remembered, his frame leaner, but the posture, the way he held his shoulders, it was him. It was Richard. For an instant, I thought my mind had fractured. I had mourned him, buried him in my heart. I stood in the rain and watched his coffin lowered into the ground. Yet here he was, walking toward me, alive. Vivian gasped, stumbling back as though she had seen a ghost. "No, this is impossible. He's dead." But he was not. He was here. My son stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on mine. They were the same eyes that had once looked up at me from a fevered child's bed, the same eyes that had shone with pride at his graduation. They were older now, shadowed by betrayal, but still my sons. I rose slowly from the bench, the box still clutched to my chest. My knees trembled, but I stood tall. The handkerchief slipped from my pocket, dangling by my side like the thread of my entire life leading to this moment. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. I could have screamed, could have collapsed into sobs, could have cursed the years and the lies and the cruel charade of his funeral, but none of that rose in me. Instead, I stepped forward and laid my hand against his cheek. My voice was steady, soft, and certain. "I knew," I whispered. "I knew you never left me." His eyes filled with tears, and he pulled me into his arms. The world around us, the agents, Samuel, the stunned faces of Vivian and Julian, the crashing waves beyond, faded into nothing. For a moment, there was only the warmth of his embrace and the steady beat of his heart against mine. "I'm sorry," he murmured into my hair. "I had to disappear. The FBI knew the danger. They took me into protection, made it look real. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't risk them finding you." I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of him, alive and real. "My son, my boy. You don't need to apologize," I said softly. "You gave me the truth. That's all I ever wanted." When we pulled apart, his gaze hardened as it shifted toward Vivian and Julian. The agents had bound their hands, their protests now little more than sputters against the tide of justice. Vivian's face was twisted with fury, but beneath it lay raw fear. She had built her world on arrogance, and now it crumbled before the one man she thought was gone forever. Richard turned back to me. "I told you once that silence was not a weakness," he said. "Now you've shown them. You've shown me." I pressed the handkerchief to my lips, dabbing at the tears that came despite my resolve. These tears were not of despair. They were released. Samuel approached, his voice quieter now. "The case against them will be held. Richard's evidence, combined with what you found, will ensure they face justice. But more than that, it was your silence, your strength, that made this possible." I nodded faintly, unable to speak. Words were unnecessary. The truth stood in the open, undeniable. Vivian shouted once more, her voice ragged. "This isn't over!" But it was. The agents led her and Julian away, their footsteps heavy against the gravel. The roses bent in the wind as though bowing to the moment. The ocean roared louder, triumphant, eternal. Richard placed his hand over mine, steady and warm. "We're free now," he said. I looked into his eyes and whispered the only words that mattered. "I always knew you hadn't abandoned me. A mother feels it, even in silence." And in that quiet garden by the sea, with the waves crashing and the petals scattering like confetti of truth, I finally felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My son was alive. Justice was unfolding, and for the first time in decades, my silence was not the mark of invisibility, but the measure of my strength. The garden slowly emptied after Vivian and Julian were taken away. The sound of the agents' radios faded into the distance, carried off by the wind. The roses swayed gently, no longer trampled by desperation, but bending back toward dignity. I stood in the silence with Richard at my side, Etienne just behind us, the three of us anchored together by a bond I never thought I would feel again. The hours that followed blurred, though I remember fragments. Samuel spoke firmly to the agents, confirming evidence would be sealed. The FBI car pulled away, Vivian's face pressed against the window, her mouth still moving in threats that no longer had weight. Julian sat stone-faced beside her, his eyes hollow, knowing the empire he had tried to steal had collapsed. Richard squeezed my hand. His strength was steady, his silence purposeful. He no longer needed to prove anything to her or to anyone. The truth itself had already won. Later, when the sun dipped toward the horizon, we returned to the summer house. The rooms were still in disarray from Vivian and Julian's frantic search, but the air inside felt lighter, as if the walls themselves knew the siege had ended. Etienne set to repairing the broken window, his hands firm and practiced. Richard gathered the torn papers, restacking them carefully, as though honoring even the smallest scraps of our life here. I moved through the house slowly, touching the door frames, the chipped paint, the seashells still scattered on the porch rail. Each object whispered a memory. Daniel's laughter, Richard's childhood shouts, even my own quiet humming as I cooked. The house had survived storms before. It would survive this one, too. That evening, we sat together at the dining table. Etienne had cooked something simple. Bread, cheese, a bottle of wine opened with the ease of an old habit. We ate in silence at first, the kind of silence that no longer felt oppressive. It was the silence of shared survival, of words unnecessary because presence was enough. Richard broke it first. "The company will need restructuring," he said softly, his voice still marked with weariness. "The FBI will prosecute them. Vivian and Julian will spend years in prison, but the work my team built will not die with their greed. It will continue, this time with honesty." I nodded, though my heart cared less about companies and shares than about the living proof of my son before me. Still, I could hear the pride beneath his exhaustion. He had not only survived, he had preserved what mattered. Etienne leaned back, his gaze steady. "It will not be easy, but you have allies, and you have your mother." His eyes flickered to me with quiet warmth. Richard smiled faintly, and for the first time in years, I saw not the CEO, not the man burdened with betrayal, but my boy again, the boy who once promised to take care of me. After dinner, we carried our chairs out to the porch. The ocean stretched before us, restless and eternal, its waves striking the cliff as if reminding us that life is never still. The wind was cold, but I wrapped myself in a shawl and let it bite my cheeks. Beside me, Richard sat with his head bowed, and Etienne leaned forward with his hands clasped. For the first time, I felt as if I belonged in the middle of something whole. As the horizon turned gold and then violet, my thoughts drifted back to the letter. Richard's words had etched themselves into my heart. "Trust me one last time, Mom." I repeated it silently, over and over, until the words felt like a prayer. I had trusted him, even when the world mocked me, even when I was given only a crumpled ticket, and he had not failed me. For decades, I had carried the weight of invisibility, convinced my silence meant weakness. Tonight, as I sat between my son and the man I once loved, I finally understood. Silence had carried me here, had preserved me long enough to see the truth unfold. I pressed the embroidered handkerchief against my lips, not to hide tears, but to honor them. My tears that evening were not of despair, but of release, as if all the years of endurance had finally given way to peace. Richard turned to me, his eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "Mom," he whispered, "I never left you. Not really." "I know," I said, my voice steady. "I always knew." The waves struck hard against the rocks, scattering spray into the air, but I was no longer afraid of the ocean's pull. For the first time, I let the sound soothe me instead of overwhelm me. As darkness fell, the three of us remained there, together, no longer bound by secrets, no longer haunted by lies. For the first time in my 72 years, I felt not just like a widow, not just like a mother, but like a woman who had carried her silence to the end and found it was enough. And when I finally rose to go inside, I smiled. Small, quiet, but real. The burden I had carried all my life was no longer mine alone. I had released it into the sea, into the night, into the truth Richard had left me. The world was not finished with me. And I was not finished with the world. The weeks that followed moved with a gentleness I had not known for decades. Vivian and Julian were no longer a shadow in our lives. The law had taken them where they belonged, and their voices no longer carried weight. The company Richard had built began its slow restructuring, guided by honest hands, no longer tainted by greed. For me, though, the truest rebuilding was not of business or property, but of something far deeper. I returned to France with Richard and Etienne. The flight that once felt like exile now felt like homecoming. When we drove again through the vineyard roads toward Chateau Beaumont, I no longer felt like a stranger being led into someone else's story. I felt like a woman who had survived her own storms and chosen to step into the sunlight. The chateau greeted us with open arms. The ivy along its walls gleamed green under the autumn sun. The vineyards stretched out in golden rows, their leaves turning with the season, shimmering as though the earth itself was clothed in memory and promise. The air smelled of grapes and soil, warm and alive. One morning, Richard and Etienne walked with me to the balcony overlooking the vineyard. The mist had lifted, replaced by pure sunlight that bathed the land in gold. From this height, the rows of vines looked endless, like threads woven into a fabric that stretched to the horizon. I leaned against the railing, the wind brushing my silver hair back from my face, and breathed deeply. In my hand, I held the handkerchief with the embroidered O. It had traveled with me through grief, humiliation, silence, and revelation. It had absorbed tears of despair and, more recently, tears of release. Now it rested in my palm as something else, not a shield to hide behind, but a symbol of endurance, of the girl I had once been, the mother I had become, and the woman I was now, whole. I looked at Richard, standing tall with the sun at his back. His eyes met mine with warmth, no longer shadowed by secrets. Beside him, Etienne stood with quiet dignity, his presence not demanding but steady, as though the years between us had folded gently away. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel what it meant to belong again, not to a role or a duty, but to a family, imperfect, scarred, but real. My thoughts turned to the words Richard had written in his letter. "Trust me one last time, Mom." I had trusted, and it had brought me here, to this vineyard, to this balcony, to this moment where the weight of silence no longer crushed me, but lifted me. I closed my eyes and whispered aloud, not just to them, but to the air, to the sea beyond, to the memory of Daniel who had once believed in me, to every woman who had ever been silenced. Silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes silence is strength. The words lingered in the sunlight, carried by the wind across the vines. They did not need to be shouted at. They needed only to be spoken, steady and sure, like a truth finally laid bare. Richard reached for my hand, closing it gently around the handkerchief. "Keep it always," he said softly. "It's more than cloth now. It's you." I smiled faintly, pressing the fabric against my heart. For so long I had hidden behind it. Now I held it openly as a banner of resilience. We stood there together, letting the silence stretch, not the silence of invisibility, but of peace. The vineyard glowed beneath us, the sunlight turning every leaf into fire. And I thought, for the first time in my 72 years, that I was no longer waiting for life to pass me by. I was living it again. As the day waned, I turned toward the camera of my memory, the imagined listener I had carried with me through this story, the unseen friend who had walked beside me in silence. To you, I say this: if you have ever felt forgotten, if you have ever been told that your silence makes you weak, know this truth. Silence can be your strength. It can carry you when nothing else does. It can guard you until the moment comes to rise. And if you, listening now, have endured betrayal, humiliation, or invisibility, what would you do in my place? Would you trust the path your loved one left you, even if it seemed foolish at first? Would you find strength in silence when the world laughed? I want to know. Share your story. Leave your words, your truths, your echoes of strength. Because our voices, even when quiet, weave together into something greater. I turned once more to the vineyard, the sunlight warming my face. The handkerchief rested easily in my palm. For decades, it had been a symbol of tears. Now it was a banner of love, endurance, and the quiet power that had carried me all this way. Silence does not mean weakness, I whispered again, the thematic line of my life now spoken without shame. Sometimes, silence is strength. And with that, I let the wind carry it outward to whoever might need it, to whoever still waited for their own turn to stand and breathe freely.